sequels. They are a gamble. When you have a film that's not only incredible, but is also a huge success, you have to face the question of how do you follow it? And arguably more importantly, should you follow it? Or should you just leave it alone? There are so many great sequels, and there are many, many bad ones. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, let me clarify. I love Aliens. I think it's great. I think it's a personal favourite and very much a comfort movie. This film manages to follow and develop on Alien in some really cool ways, but it also does a few things that maybe aren't so cool. Alien was a masterclass in sci-fi horror, but Aliens blasted onto the screen as an explosive action horror, completely shifting the tone of this biomechanical world from unsettling and tense and claustrophobic to loud and dominating. The biggest thing Aliens did was the huge increase in scale. Most of these changes from Alien to Aliens make so much sense when you realise that it was written and directed by James Cameron. And before I jump into the details of how Aliens developed on Alien, I'm going to go over some quick details of the background of this film. The original Alien was released in 1979, and due to studio and legal troubles, the sequel didn't release until 1986. The same year as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is quite interesting with the connections between the original Alien and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The original film was written by Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett, and directed by Ridley Scott. O'Bannon's vision for Alien was a scary one, that put the audience face to face with a new yet familiar threat, and that terror was amplified by Ridley Scott's ability to create a nightmarish and unsettling atmosphere through his cinematography. But the sequel was written and directed by James Cameron, who at the time had only directed 2 feature films, Piranha 2 and The Terminator. Obviously, the former is not much of a statement on his style of filmography, but Terminator is a great way to see the early formation of James Cameron's signature style. To put it simply, James Cameron loves to throw money at an idea, and that's not meant in a way of covering up a shit script with a high budget. He throws money at an idea in a way that shows how he dedicates everything to make sure each element of his film is done to the best degree that he can. Whether that's the practical effects, the camera work, the set design, and Terminator was his first real chance to put all of that to work. So his next film had the potential to step that up in every way. And in my opinion, it did. Aliens, in my opinion, is the peak of James Cameron's filmography. Aliens was made on an honestly small budget of $18.5 million. Cameron was firing on all cylinders for this because the sheer sense of scale that he managed to create is insane. The effects, the world building, the costume design, the prop work, all of it. For a relatively small budget, this managed to nail every aspect of its world building and action. So, the film is great. Its visual aspects are perfect, but Alien stood out because of its incredible allegory and the presentation of its messaging. And while Aliens does continue some of that, I'm mainly here to talk about how it diverges from its predecessor and becomes its own entity, expanding on areas of the original messaging, but also developing points of its own. James Cameron films are very well known for having a certain atmosphere. Avatar, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and Aliens all share some similarities in theme. They all have an underlying political theme. Avatar reflecting colonization, genocide, and the stealing of resources, Terminator 2 reflecting police brutality, and Aliens featuring a lot of anti-capitalism and anti-military messaging. The other thing that they all have in common is those messages are presented with the subtlety of a bulldozer. Now, this is not necessarily a problem. Not every underlying message has to be subtle. Sometimes an obvious and in-your-face approach is needed, and honestly that approach does work for a lot of James Cameron's films. But when you're following something as nuanced and detailed as Alien, the sequel having such a heavy-handed metaphor is going to stick out like a sore thumb. Especially when some of the main message behind the original film is honestly lost by the sequel. As much as I genuinely do love Aliens, it makes some questionable decisions in its writing that I'm not a fan of. This is where my view on this film becomes complicated, because I genuinely love this film, and I think its writing is very well done. I think its story flows well, and as a standalone film, there's pretty much nothing I would change. But because it's a sequel, the implications of its writing expand past this film alone. As I hopefully made clear in this video, the original Alien featured heavy messaging about sexual assault, rape, tocophobia, and the way that men contribute to that. That allegory is portrayed through multiple aspects of the film. To quickly recap, the life cycle of the xenomorph being very predatory and sexual, the forceful impregnation of the victims, the way that Ripley, a woman, is overlooked and ignored by men, which then led to the deaths of the rest of the crew, the visual design of the xenomorph, the moon, and the derelict, and many other elements that I covered in my Alien video essay. In comparison, while Aliens does sustain some aspects of the original meaning, some of it is lost, and even somewhat damaged. The xenomorph still reproduced through forceful impregnation, leading to a chestburster killing the victims. That's still present here and shown in a horrific way, but realistically, that can't be fully credited to this film. It was created for the original, and all this film is doing is continuing it. It pretty much lost a fair amount of the subtle messaging about men's contributions to rape culture, which was, in my opinion, the strongest and most powerful aspect of the allegory in the original film, and the best demonstration of Dan O'Bannon's intent with his story. This loses the original's subtlety and replaces it with a good, but admittedly heavy-handed message on anti-capitalism and military power. Cameron's message of anti-capitalism is done in a similar way as Ridley Scott and Dan O'Bannon's message, but, as I said, with less of the rape culture messaging. In the original, Ash was the stand-in for men, as an institution. He was there to represent the way in which men contribute to rape culture, leading to rape becoming normalised in our society. But in Aliens, we have Burke. He's here to represent the way in which people will throw other people under the bus in order to sustain their place in a capitalist society. Another important message, but done in a lot more of an in-your-face way. He does contribute in another way, which I will get onto later, but right now it's time to cover Bishop. As I hope I made clear, one of the most interesting parts of the messaging in Alien is the role that Ash plays in Ripley's experience. Ash represents men, and the way their behaviour contributes to the dangers and threats that women face. Ash was a synthetic, a dangerous man that could blend in with the other men, because the difficulty with identifying dangerous people in real life is bad men look like good men. I think Ripley's instant reaction to Bishop being hostility is a great representation of how the trauma affected her trust in people, showing the way in which people who experience trauma from sexual assault struggle with trusting people after. Because how do you know who to trust when evil people blend in with everyone else? Add on the crippling fear of being harmed again, and trusting people feels like an impossible task. Rape culture is so deeply bred into men that finding men you can trust is like trying to find a grain of sand in a river of shit. Most people don't want to wade through the shit to find that one grain. As for the military in the film, we have the Colonial Marines. This is the least subtle message throughout the entire film. The Marines are arrogant and stupid. Mostly men, and pretty much all of the danger they get in is somewhat self-inflicted. That's not to say that the xenomorphs and the situation they are in is not also at fault, but their arrogance definitely made the situation worse, possibly indicating a message of the stupid, toxic masculinity that's bred into the military. Also, the choice to make the Marines so childish could even suggest commentary on the way that teenagers, specifically teenage boys, are groomed into the military-industrial complex, playing on the desire to be seen as a hero, a behaviour that's bred into boys from a very young age, showing how dangerous and honestly evil the systems in place are, and how easily and happily they will endanger lives for their own gain. Interestingly, Cameron also made it clear that military technology is significantly more advanced than anything any domestic institution has. Throughout the Alien franchise, we regularly see the difference between the technology of normal people and the military. Something Alien has always done really well is a natural progression in technological advancements. In Alien, we see an improvised motion detector. It's bulky and heavy, but by Alien Isolation, we see the design has been significantly improved. It's smaller, it's easily handheld, and much more efficient. But by Aliens, which is 57 years after Alien, the motion sensor is significantly more accurate, but when you see technology from this same time in the hands of normal people, it's nowhere near advanced as the military. This is also seen through their transport. The military ships are sleeker, more efficient in pretty much every way, and their designs mirror real-life military vehicles. The military stand as a very good demonstration of how different people can be groomed and manipulated into the systems in place, in this case the military-industrial complex. But earlier I mentioned that Burke has another representation within this film, and in my opinion, it's the best part of the writing in Aliens. Burke is used to represent the way that people will disregard others to get ahead in a capitalist society. But that message runs deep in his character and his actions throughout the film. He's a company man, a victim of capitalism that doesn't even realise it, representing the people that claim to be capitalist and support a capitalist society, despite being a victim of the things that it creates. To quote something I'm sure many of you have heard before, he's not a capitalist, he's a worker with Stockholm Syndrome. He represents people that uphold and support a capitalist system despite the fact that they don't truly benefit from it, and honestly never will, all in the hopes of gaining a little more money or recognition for their work. He represents the manipulated and easily convinced people that support billionaires and corporations that don't have their best interest at heart. As an extension of that, he also contributes to a representation of those people being very ignorant to the issues that normal people face, and supporting people that actively contribute to those problems. In the context of the film, Burke contributes to the danger of death that Newt and Ripley both face. A woman and a young girl being put in a position of risk and danger by a man in a higher position of authority than them. But in the case of what this would be representing, it's the people that directly support a paedophile and war criminal in the name of protecting their country and the people in it. Or the people that directly vote for and support laws that put women at risk by taking away their healthcare in the name of saving women. Or the people that protest outside a migrant hotel in the name of saving women and girls, despite having charges of domestic abuse. Thinking that they are working towards a good and honest goal, despite the fact that they are contributing to a system that puts people at risk on a regular basis. Burke is probably the strongest part of the metaphor that still remains in this film. It's a very different approach to the messaging, but nevertheless, it does stand as the main plot point that continues it. Even his end adds to that messaging. The fact that he was killed by the very thing that he was trying to uphold. He's desperate to get a xenomorph specimen, or a facehugger specimen, or some form of that threat back to the company. He's desperate to contribute to that danger, but it's that danger that he's contributing to that ends up killing him, showing that the people that stand by and support these dangerous figures of authority will eventually and inevitably be harmed or killed by what they have put in place. Because at the end of the day, if you actually need help from those figures of authority, they won't help you because they don't care about you. Realistically, Weyland-Yutani does not care whether Burke lives or dies as long as they get what they wanted, the specimen. He's a tool to them, not a real person, not someone of value, but he has been manipulated into believing that he is of value to them, believing that he does matter, believing that he has a chance to become as high up as they are if he can just do this one last thing for them. He is the pinnacle of corporate manipulation. To go even further into that, I think his role in the story and the way in which he stands as a figure for Weyland-Yutani makes a comment on the way in which people are groomed into these systems. As I mentioned earlier, people are groomed into the military-industrial complex. Yes, groomed. It's grooming. From a young age, the systems in place prey on the vulnerabilities and malleable minds of the young, implanting complexes and dependencies, and Burke and the Marines are victims of that. This film does fail to sustain some of the stronger aspects of the original meaning, but it also manages to take a different approach to demonstrate similar fears and threats through its story. Instead of the sexualized threats posed to women presented in the original film, this aims to show the systematic dangers posed to people's lives every day, and the way in which governments and corporations see people as commodities and tools for their war games. There is also so much that this film does in a much simpler way that works so well in its favour, so let's move on to that. As I mentioned in my Alien video essay, the world of Alien is a lot more detailed than it gets credit for, and a lot of the foundation of that detail can be credited to this film rather than the original. Don't get me wrong, the original Alien set the tone of the world and laid the groundwork for a lot of the world building, but some of the additions made by James Cameron ended up being some of my favourite parts of the lore. For example, James Cameron answered the question of how does the life cycle start? Answer: the Queen. In the original Alien, we see the overmorphs, the facehuggers, the chestbursters, the xenomorphs, but we never see how this all starts. Technically, if you include the director's cut, there is a scene of a process called egg morphing that was never included in the theatrical cut, and while egg morphing is still a part of the xenomorph life cycle, it isn't where it begins. Many species on planet Earth are matriarchal, and when it came to deciding how the xenomorphs were organised, James Cameron decided to make them a matriarchal system. It all starts with the Queen. This is a rough diagram to explain their life cycle, although it is a lot more complicated than this can truly explain, and a lot more complicated than I have time to explain. The important thing is, Aliens introduced the idea of the Xenomorph Queen, one of the most menacing and honestly cool parts of Alien lore, and it's only a part of Alien lore because of this film. Overall, this film massively increased the scale of the world of Alien. In the original film, we saw one singular xenomorph. We saw tons of overmorphs, but we never really felt the impact of that because they were in one scene, and once we left that location, they were never seen again. James Cameron challenged that by presenting us with an army, specifically an army of warriors. The change in physical design of the xenomorphs led to an enormous expansion on their lore as a species, introducing the idea of multiple variations. And to quickly list a few, we have warriors, drones, runners, the Queen, the King, the Queen Mother, the Praetorian Guard, the Hive Warrior, and the Neomorph. It's hard to say where their species would be without this film. I highly doubt that Alien would never have had a sequel if Aliens hadn't happened. It's very hard to believe that no one would have tried to follow up Alien between 1979 and now. But I think that without Aliens, xenomorph biology would be nowhere near as fascinating. But its depiction of the titular aliens is not the only way in which it expanded the world. In a much more simple way, it developed humanity. We see more of the world outside of the Nostromo. We saw elements of Weyland-Yutani that we had never seen before, finally putting a visual representation to that looming threat of the original film. We saw more of the technology, the stations, the systems, and the government, which also led to an enormous expansion later on in the franchise. Similarly to how I think Aliens is responsible for the expansion in xenomorph biology, I also think this film should be credited for the expansion in human history within the world of Alien. Humanity was also expanded on by the improvements in technology. I already mentioned how we see technological advancements throughout the franchise, but Just seeing the basic improvements within this 57-year time jump really gives a sense of humanity's development. Even in simple lines of dialogue. For example, when Bishop talks about the previous models of synthetic being a bit twitchy, showing just how normalized this kind of technology is within this world. It slightly removes a sense of that fantastical and impossible nature of a sci-fi world and brings you down to a level that you can believe, sucking you into this world because you could believe it's real. The dialogue is normal. People speak how real people speak. And in a much less serious sense, something else this film does really well is giving us an excuse to see more of Ellen Ripley. I know that sounds silly, like I'm making a joke, but as I've made clear before, she is, in my opinion, the best written fictional character of all time. And in all of her appearances throughout this franchise, except this piece of shit, I've been happy to see her on screen. Now, while there are many parts of this film that I thoroughly enjoy, it's time to talk about how it fails in continuing the original message of Alien. Or falls short. Fail sounds a bit harsh. I've spoken about how it succeeds in expanding the world and demonstrating its own meaning, so I wouldn't necessarily say it fails, but there is definitely some stuff that it neglects, and some stuff that it almost goes back on as it shifts into its own messaging. The original Alien was a phenomenal film, bringing Ripley to screen, who has been described as a feminist icon of cinema, one of, if not the best female role model in film, a character in a situation that is so insane and unrealistic, yet mirrors the stress, fear, and tension of very real-world situations, giving you a character that you can watch in a situation that allows you to escape into a fictional world, but at the same time, genuinely has an important message that you can apply to real life. Alien holds a vital spot in the history of sci-fi, horror, and cinema in general, but it also holds a vital part in the history of messages in art. Dan O'Bannon is quoted as wanting to attack the men in the audience. I've previously described it as targeting the people that ignore the issue. In my Alien video essay, I mentioned that there would be no point in trying to teach women about the dangers of sexual assault, because what are you going to teach them that they don't already know? What is a man going to tell women that they aren't already aware of? And Aliens kind of goes back on that. Somewhat unintentionally, but it unravels some of the nuance of that story and its messaging. One of the small ways in which it does that is through something I've already mentioned, making the xenomorphs a matriarchal species. I mentioned how I thought that is something cool, and I still do think it's cool, but in the grand scheme of the symbolism in Alien, it doesn't help. When thinking of the xenomorph as a physical representation of rape and sexual assault, a physical embodiment of the threats and dangers posed to women because of men, you end up seeing the xenomorph as representing a rapist, their life cycle representing sexual assault, the chestbursters representing the pregnancies conceived through rape, and heavily hinting towards tocophobia, the fear of pregnancy and childbirth, and showing that in a horrifying, gory, and bloody way. So, keeping in mind the idea that the xenomorph is there to represent a rapist, and rape culture and sexual assault as a whole, making their species led by a woman could be interpreted as unintentionally implying that women are at the fault of that. Now, I'm not saying that this was intentional. I want to make it clear I do not think that this was a planned decision to imply any of that. All I'm saying is that when looking at the intended metaphor behind the original film, making the head of the representation of rape female could be misinterpreted and possibly seen as damaging to the original message and its effect on the audience. Anyway, now to talk about one of the main ways in which Aliens fails to continue the messaging behind Alien. This is one that I've seen a lot of people talk about. Newt. Newt is a young girl found by Ripley on LV-426. In some of the Alien novels, we find out more details about her life on the moon, but as far as we're aware within Aliens, she's one of the colonists, her parents are dead, and she's alone. She was taken in by Ripley and the Marines and kept safe from the dangers that she had been facing on her own. Ripley is then presented as a motherly figure, and honestly, this is kind of unfortunate. It was already established that Ripley is a mother. She has a daughter, Amanda Ripley, but we never see any of that fully represented on screen. At least no further than her seeing a picture of her daughter. Unless you count Alien Isolation, but at the time, that didn't exist. A part of me feels like Cameron's intention here was to show a strong female character being a mother, and it not stopping her from being a strong female character. An intention that I can respect. Yet I wish he did it with a different character, because Ripley has already been at the forefront of a film that heavily demonstrates the fear of pregnancy and childbirth, and the loss of autonomy associated with it. She was a champion of a film that depicted pregnancy and childbirth as a horrific thing. Granted, a large part of that was due to the fact that those pregnancies and childbirth not only led to death, but they were also depicting rape and sexual assault. But the heavy tocophobia symbolism was important, and personally, I feel that taking a character who was shown to be a strong character and simplifying her to be what most women were in fiction at the time had the opposite effect of what I think the intention was. Instead of developing her further as a strong character, it just lumped her in as a stereotype. It didn't necessarily completely remove her position as that strong character, but it also didn't really develop it. Moving back onto the xenomorphs and how they are depicted, they take on a more of a background role in this film. In the original, they were the pinnacle of the physical representation of the messaging. Even when the xenomorph was not on screen, it still felt like it was watching you. It was looming in the background. You couldn't escape the horror. That is partially due to the set design and Geiger's design of the titular alien, making you feel like you could see it in the background, something that is interestingly continued into the game Alien Isolation. There's so many moments throughout that game where you think that you can see the xenomorph, but it's just a piece of the ship. The point is, the xenomorph was a very present threat in the original film. That's not to say that they aren't present in Aliens, but they take on much more of a simple role. A simple, dangerous creature organised into a pack. They serve as a threat to hunt our characters instead of the slow, graceful force of evil that we had in the original film. Because of this, a lot of the sexualized imagery of the original xenomorph and its behaviour is somewhat lost in this film. And with it, some of the tension is lost. Partially as a result of the change in how the xenomorph is presented, but also partially as a result of the larger scale sets. Expanding the size of the world physically meant that you lose that claustrophobic nature that was present in the original film. And that added a lot of tension and stress to Ripley's original situation, and it's not really present here. As I mentioned earlier, some of the original meaning is lost and replaced with different messaging, which is not necessarily a huge problem. This continued the surface level story of the first film in a very creative and admittedly cool way, and it still has an important underlying message, albeit a different one, but still important. But the main part of the loss of the original message that kind of saddens me is the loss of the direct connection from the xenomorph to sexual assault. That relation from the fictional threat to the real life has always been fascinating to me. That real relation, that underlying theme. The danger of the reproductive cycle is still present, granted it's weaker, but it is still here, and still admittedly horrifying, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a lot less nuanced. In the original, each stage of the life cycle had a detailed connection to different aspects of sexual assault and rape culture, and most of that isn't very present here, or even represented at all. This is probably the main way in which the original meaning is somewhat lost within this film. But maybe that meaning is lost because we've zoomed out. The original Alien was claustrophobic, close quarters, it focused on the close connection of a small group of people, and the way that one threat worked its way through them, killing all of them. That was then revealed to be many threats combined into one that they couldn't escape. Whereas this film expands on the scale. As I mentioned, it shows the sheer size of this world. As we zoom out, the smaller details become harder to notice. Those subtle hints towards a very real danger become easier to miss. Out of sight, out of mind. This film chooses to focus on the problems that exist at a systematic level, which is a very different approach from the original film, but as I said, it's important in its own right. Because realistically, most of the problems and difficulties that people face on a day-to-day basis are caused by or start at a systematic level. We live under the boot of the system, and the important decision is, do you choose to lay under that boot and lick it, or fight your way out? You could see this film as a simple sci-fi action film with no underlying message or meaning and simply a surface level intent of entertainment. But I do think it's more than that. I think there is more here. Granted, I think there is less messaging here than there is in Alien, but the messaging here is still important. To me, we're supposed to see Ripley as a victim of capitalism that wouldn't take it anymore. Somebody who finally saw the faults and problems within the system she was a part of and fought her way out. Whereas Burke contrasts that by being the kind of person who would rather lay down and die. Somebody who will gladly lie under the boot as pressure gets applied until he bursts.